blinded me with science. She blinded me
Welcome. Today we're actually going to talk about pediatric and young adolescent, young adult mental health emergencies. And what do you do? How do you recognize them? What are the resources that are available? There are millions of families in the U.S. every day that are actually facing this. And we have a guest today that is a power couple that I will introduce shortly. And so I wanted to really kind of just first sort of set the background a little bit on mental health and mental health conditions in the pediatric and adolescents. First of all, 1 in 5 children or adolescents will actually find themselves with a mental health condition, whether or not it's diagnosed or undiagnosed. And what happens is, families, if you have a child or a young adult and they fall and break a bone or they have a fever or a cough, you kind of know what to do. What happens with mental health emergencies is they can be really harder to recognize, and it may even be more challenging to actually navigate the healthcare system as far as where do you go. Emergency departments across the country deal with mental health emergencies. We are open 24/7. People do bring their children and adolescents and also their adult selves if that's the case. And we see a significant amount of pediatric and young adult mental health diseases and crises. It can range from, anxiety attacks to depression, to schizophrenia, to bipolar, to eating disorders. Specifically, we have been seeing a very increased incidence of this in the pediatric and adolescent population. One of the reasons why we believe we're seeing this more is because COVID-19, when people caught COVID-19, it actually has a higher concentration of the virus in the brain than it did in the lungs. And so some of the research now is going over what did that pandemic actually do, not only to us as a population, but what did it do to our neurodevelopment. So these things can be really, really challenging. A teenager experiencing their first psychotic episode might present with confusion or agitation or just behavior that seems a little bit out of character. Families can be really scared and terrified. It can be a very isolating experience. Parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents and godmothers and godfathers can kind of question, well, how did we get here? What signs did we miss? Or did we miss any signs? What's going to happen next? So we're going to kind of discuss all of this today so that we get a better understanding of what resources are really available to help families advocate for their loved ones and really navigate these difficult situations. Before I bring in the guest, I want to actually just go over just a couple of things because I get asked this a lot. People say, well, how do you know, I even have a mental health disorder? How are these things diagnosed? So I want to actually just quickly kind of go over this and the categories of mental health disorders. So first of all, mental health disorders are diagnosed by clinical interviews, and that's where you're gathering personal and medical and psychiatric histories. Also, there's behavioral observations of people's mood or cognitive function. In some cases, there's psychological testing or questionnaires. And then finally, there is the DSM-5. The DSM-5 stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual. This is a manual that is put out, and it is a conference of psychiatrists nationwide that actually create this manual. And this manual for every diagnosis, for every mental health diagnosis, has criteria for what actually leads to that diagnosis. So for instance, many of us have been sad for one day. Being sad for one day doesn't make you have depression. The DSM book will say, there needs to be profound sadness, that's uninterrupted for a certain period of time. So all of these things kind of get together and actually lead to mental health diagnosis. So I just want people to realize that this is really, the DSM-5 has been updated and comes out regularly since the 1950s or so. And in the DSM, they have different categories. So you have different categories of mental health disorders. You have mood disorders, which are like depression, mania, bipolar disorder. You have anxiety disorders. which can be panic attacks, social anxiety. You have psychotic disorders, and psychotic disorders are where there's kind of like a break from reality. So in a psychotic disorder, someone may have visual or auditory hallucination. Those are things like schizophrenia. There are personality disorders where, that's really kind of more where the behavior is deviating from sort of cultural expectations. So you'll hear people talk about antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. You can have neurodevelopment disorders, and those are things like autism and attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. We have a whole category of obsessive compulsive and related diseases, and those are OCD. People talk about OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphia disorder. There's a category of trauma and stress-related disorders, and these are disorders that are actually triggered by an exposure to a traumatic or stressful disorder. Then you also have eating disorders, anorexia nervosa, bulimia. Another category is somatic symptoms, and these are like where someone has a mental health disorder and then it presents like they have this chronic abdominal pain and no one can ever find out what it's related to. So that's like a somatic symptom disorder. So the condition actually presents as a medical complaint. Then you have dissociative disorders where there's sort of a disruption of identity, a disruption of memory. You can have dissociative identity disorders. You have a whole category of substance abuse and addictive disorders, alcohol use disorder, opioid use, gambling addiction, sex addiction, etc. Then you have neurocognitive disorders, which are like your Alzheimer's disease, sleep and wake disorders, which are things like narcolepsy, where you suddenly fall asleep and you can't stay up, or insomnia. And then there's a whole category of sexual dysfunction and gender dysphoria. So as you can see, it is a lot of things that we actually really take into consideration when we actually look at mental health disorders. All right, I'd like to introduce our guests for today. We have today Marla and Dave Thomas. And Dave Thomas is a part of the Grammy-winning group Take Six that actually did Spread Love, If We Ever, and Biggest Part of Me. Marla, his wife, is a successful realtor, and today they have Mental Health Mondays with Marla and Dave, and they also run a nonprofit called Loving Beyond Reason. Marla and Dave Thomas, thank you and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, absolutely.
It's our pleasure.
Well, Dr. V, I'll tell you this. It's really a labor of love.
As we are listening, I just want to say that I appreciate your opening, because when it sounds like a lot of information, but very few people really break down all the variants.
Yes.
And the variants in mental health.
Right.
And so the way that, I'm really hoping that people really took that in, and I almost, the joke of it all is it sounds like all of us. And when I say that it sounds like all of us, I think people need to really understand that mental health, like everything else, there's a spectrum, and it's really just a consensus norm. And the
Right.
brain is very much like everything else, when you have organs, and we accept that other things have deficits.
You can have kidney problems.
Right.
That's not an issue.
Diabetes.
Everyone accepts. There's no stigma around having
Correct.
kidney disease.
Right.
You can have lung disease. You can have heart disease. But if you have a mental health condition, suddenly no one wants to actually deal with that straight up and head on.
Yes.
So much stigma surrounding it. And I'm glad that you made the distinction between to actually deal with that straight up and head on.
Yes.
There's so much stigma surrounding it. And I'm glad that you made the distinction between what I like to say. One of the things about social media is that if you give it too much weight, everybody's a narcissist nowadays.
Right.
Narcissism is literally the term du jour running amok on social media. And just because you're selfish doesn't necessarily mean you're a narcissist.
Right.
And we can have narcissistic traits from time to time and behave that way.
Absolutely.
Doesn't necessarily mean we're a diagnosable narcissist. So, I mean, those are the things those distinctions are very important. And I like what Marla just said about it sounds like all of us, because that's the way we normalize being treatment.
Right.
We normalize treatment because this is really about children. And it's very difficult to diagnose a child with certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia or even borderline or some of the personality disorders. They might show the symptoms early, but it would be inappropriate for the doctor to say this is definitely a personality disorder, because as children grow, they go through different phases.
Absolutely.
And they behave differently.
Absolutely.
So the thing that I would like to tell people, and I say this all the time, why don't we normalize, like we go to a doctor for a checkup? When our kids are very young, 4, 5 years old, start taking them to therapy.
Yes.
Even if nothing is wrong, just a checkup.
Well, so therefore, they're, and we'll get into our experience, but it's what we realize is that right now, especially in the minority community, mental health, you get to a point where it looks like it's attached to something's wrong with you. You're
Right.
going to therapy, like you've got this issue, versus you don't feel that way when you get your car tuned up.
That's
You
right.
gotta get an oil change unless you have an electric vehicle. So the reality is, if we normalize some of this as a routine understanding of care, it's
Right.
not so shocking, and it's not an indictment later on.
Absolutely. I think also, too, people don't realize that we all deal with very stressful things in life occasionally. And those are stresses and strains on our mental illness. Just like if you ran a marathon, it would be a stress or a strain on your heart, right? I know that, after I live in Washington, D.C., and after 9/11, with those planes, possibly coming to the White House and the Pentagon and everywhere, I had severe panic attacks after that. Like, I had to go see a therapist, right? And one of the first things she told me was to turn off the news, which I was like, duh, I don't know why I didn't think of that. And sometimes you really do need to speak to somebody outside of yourself to actually get a grip on what's going on. And a lot of us have different challenges. We're all going to have, loved ones in our family that may die. You may lose a job. You may deal with divorce. You may have any number of things going on. And it's okay if you need some support during those time periods.
You know what's interesting about what you just said, and I know this that I'm about to say is going to help somebody. I always let people know, now that Dave and I have been down this road and have been, with our own family for so long, and have gotten, gone to the professionals and set, and studied with those who are at the top of, the field when it comes to books and borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia and all the things. I let people know now that you brought up something right there, stress, and I'm going to say it again, stress is the number one thing that causes mental health fracture.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to say this, and it's going to make – I like to link things to just things that are common sense. I want you to think about children. When they're babies to preschool age, right? Mm-hmm. Their whole environment is usually, in the standard case, your family. Right. Then you go to your first time to begin to individuate is preschool.
Right.
Oh, I like these kids over here. I develop friendships, but it's general, because that's just a stage of life.
Right. Then
you leave elementary school, and now you begin to enter your first collision with stress for most kids.
Right.
The expectation of socialization.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And you're junior high, and you're waking up to your sexual self and your attractions and things of the sort, and then you go from junior high to high school, and then the stress of all of the things you've picked up to now, and then what are you going to do with your life?
Right.
And now what? And are you gonna perform academically, and are you going to perform in a sport? And then are you going to go to school? And hey, what are you're going to be 18. You got to make it. You got to do something. So I look at that, and we look at, and I'm going to tie this to my retro view of my son in particular, our son, who is now 35, and he is diagnosed with bipolar 1 schizoaffective disorder. And we started seeing some of these things in junior high, at his first time in junior high. We didn't identify it as that
Right.
because we didn't know. We didn't know.
Right.
But right.
And I'll add this, that not only did we not identify it as that, because, and this is something for parents to understand as well, if you don't know to look for that, you're automatically going to think this is a behavioral development issue that needs to either be punished away or explained away or just have some conversations with, or, you know, if you believe in spanking, then, you know, those are the things that you approach. But it's really a mental health issue that is developing and you're just not aware. And if you're not in the habit of already taking your kids to therapy, it might be too late before you actually find out.
So this is
Right.
interesting. So what sort of early signs did you see that you didn't really know how important they were? Or what early signs did you see and you did realize something was important?
Well, two things, ironically, is that between our eldest child, our daughter, and our middle child, which is our son, we have 3, there were 7 different identifiable diagnoses in time. One
Okay.
was diagnosed at 21, the other one was diagnosed at 23, for a full understanding.
Right.
But with both, here are the early signs. With the oldest, which is personality disorder based, she never really connected, ever, period.
They should be walking around 12 to 14 months, talking around 2.5, 3 years old. And I think that, when you get older, people forget that the milestones, when you're talking about someone who is 10 to 16 years old, a lot of it has to do with socialization. And how are they socializing at school? How are they performing at school? Are they kind of checking out? It can sometimes be assumed that, well, maybe they're a loner or maybe they're lazy, right? It can kind of be passed off as that, when really what you probably need to do is go get checked. Go get checked. So tell me, where did you first go? Like, where did you first go for help? Or tell me what did you do?
Well, we were blessed that Marla's mom, she worked for the VA.
Okay.
And by the time she retired, she was the head of nursing for all of Southern California VAs. Mm-hmm. But one of her specialties, as she was matriculating through her career, was psychiatric nursing.
Okay.
And so she had so much experience that she would tell us certain things early on, hey, you know what, our oldest daughter and I, and I'm going to say this up front, that we are reluctant to say her name only because we don't mind sharing to help other people, but sometimes you can only share to the extent that it's not going to hurt somebody else, if that makes any sense.
Right.
And so we have to be aware of that as well.
People can, our story is out there.
It's pretty public.
Yeah, exactly. So we like Dave said, though, we don't harp on the name, but definitely, we are good identifying the fact that this is our experience.
Right. So you had a family member that had some knowledge and then could say, hey, you might want to get this checked.
Right.
Literally. And so we would go in, and then, you go to one psychologist and they would diagnose with one thing. And, sometimes, and this is the thing that people have to understand as well. Not every doctor, and please forgive me, Dr. V, but not every doctor is as skilled or knowledgeable or knows how to apply wisdom to the medical knowledge that
Absolutely.
they have as every other doctor.
Absolutely.
So we would get one diagnosis and we would say, man, that just
Doesn't fit.
There's characteristics outside of this diagnosis that don't quite fit.
Right.
So you go to another doctor, and you finally get to a doctor that can fully explain all the things, behaviors that you've been seeing in a diagnosable way. And that I'm glad you brought up the DSM-5 because, and even then, there are going to be little nuances that could be in the cracks, but diagnosis is mainly for treatment.
Right. Correct. Correct.
And when it comes to, especially when it comes to medication, so the treatment protocols are specific to the diagnosis.
Absolutely. So the accurate diagnosis is really, really important, because I think that people have to have the stamina and the motivation to keep trying and going to different therapists till they get something that works. Because you were talking about, Dave, that, you originally, did you go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist? Because I want to just...
Psychologist.
Okay.
Psychologist first.
Okay. All right.
And I would love for you, Dr. V, to make that distinction. I can make it, but as well, I'm glad you asked that question, because there is a difference.
Yes, there is a very, very big difference, and I know the names kind of sound similar, but I'm gonna keep it really simple for people. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor that has gone to medical school and has gone and done a residency. Right. And they are able to prescribe medication, and they sometimes also do therapy, depending upon what they feel comfortable doing. They may or may not have a psychologist in their office, but psychologists work separately. Psychologists, are actually probably not the best person to go to for a diagnosis. And I'm gonna say that because they haven't done a medical residency program. So when you're a medical doctor and you do a residency program, you actually spend 4 years working in mental health hospitals and mental health outpatient. So you see the most extreme forms and a larger variety of mental health diseases. When you're a psychologist could have their master's or their PhD. They often work in an outpatient setting. They get their experience in an outpatient setting, and they don't actually do a formal residency in a mental health hospital. The other thing about a psychiatrist, which is the physician, it is very important that some medical diseases will look like a mental health disorder. So you've got to be able to separate first. And when people come to the emergency department, one of the first things we do is we medically clear them, and we make sure, is this a medical diagnosis? You can have lupus and it can look like you have a mental health disorder. Mm-hmm. So it's not. So I just want to just kind of explain to people the difference between a psychiatrist, which is a physician, went to medical school, did a residency, and a psychologist, which is not a physician, did not do a residency, and cannot prescribe medication. So I
really appreciate that distinction, because that's what we ran into. Mm-hmm. Because when you're talking to a psychologist, like you're explaining, Dr. V, there's a few things that are very important for you to have a successful therapy session ongoing with a psychologist. First of all, you have to also be somebody that the child wants to talk to.
Right.
If the child really doesn't have a good rapport with that psychologist, the talk therapy is not really going to be as successful as you would like. But what we found out was that certain psychologists, when they find out that, we're trying to go through some talk therapy, but I'm coming up with some things that might be a little bit more concerning, that's when a good psychologist refers you to a psychiatrist.
Correct.
Because they believe that you are diagnosable. But again, to be diagnosed, you got to go to the psychiatrist, like you said.
Yeah.
So that's what we ran into. So we were going through different psychologists at the beginning, and they would say, well, this is what I think, but it just wasn't meeting the standard for the DSM. So by the time our oldest daughter started in her therapy, she was in maybe fifth grade. Mm-hmm, fourth, fifth grade. And then by the time we started understanding that, hey, this might be a good thing to start taking our kids to therapy, we started our son probably around sixth grade.
Okay.
Sixth, seventh grade, yeah.
Okay.
Junior high, yeah.
So you went to a couple of psychologists, and then you finally went to a psychiatrist, and then they both were diagnosed?
Well, that was a long that spread of time was a lot longer, meaning that, so remember, the diagnosis for our daughter came at 21.
Okay.
The diagnosis, the confirmation, and other things had been tossed around, but when we understood and had a full grip on what was happening with our son, that diagnosis came at 23.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
And there are so many things looped into that, which is why it was amazing to hear you. I've never really listened to a doctor before who's sharing information with people be so detailed, because our son, it took a minute to uncover his situation because he had an addiction issue.
Yes.
In coming out of high school into his early adulthood.
Right.
And that went as far as heroin.
Right.
So, and then he went to rehab for 18 months, and there was never another drug. But outside of that, that's when his diagnosis came. So he did an 18 months live-in program for rehab, and then at 21 went to college, and then at 20 and then fractured his junior year mentally.
Right.
And that's when we understood, whoa, this is something altogether different. And he went, and his diagnosis with a psychiatrist happened at 23, and we said, oh, now we understand.
Right. And to just concisely piggyback on what Marla's saying, all up until that point, he had been diagnosed with anxiety disorder.
And as a child, ADHD.
Exactly. And so when we say finally diagnosed at 23 or at 21, what we mean is a diagnosis that finally fit all of the characteristics that we had experienced in behavior.
Yeah.
And I will say this, the greatest issue for parents, Dr. V, is denial. And I want to assure parents that that's normal, but the quicker you open your mind to other options or possibilities, and the better you're going to be equipped to support whatever with
Absolutely.
your child. Because in other words, there's so many things, and I mentioned the ADHD, and that happened when he was young.
Right.
And David in particular, and we're very open. He was like, we live in the South. My son is, being a minority. There's no way, because they suggested medication.
Right.
And we didn't.
And he was 3.
He was preschool age.
He was preschool age. Yes.
He was
yes.
like 4. He was about 4. Yes, he was
Yes.
preschool age. But they were like, look, there's a problem here. And Dave was like, are you kidding? They're just, we're not doing that.
Wait, and on top of it, my dad was a psychologist.
No. All righty. Oh, wait. We've got a caller on line 2, Miss Daniels. You have a question here to ask. Go ahead.
I do. Listen, Dr. V, I am thoroughly enjoying this show today and welcome your guest. I feel like I'm talking to myself with your guest. I have unfortunately lost my daughter in this battle, but she would have been 34 this year. And what's happened is, as I'm listening to your guests, Marla and Dave, and my daughter's name is Marla, just what that struggle looked like when the children were younger. And I always tell people when they say, how do you feel you lost your daughter? And I say, you know what, you guys, God loved her more. And I knew at 3, 5, 7, and 9, and I always encourage people, because I identify with you, you just have no idea about when we see these precursors. And I tell people I'm not a doctor and I don't play one on TV, and whether I saw a psychologist or a psychiatrist, we as parents knew. We know that there is something different there. And even though I took my daughter to counseling and tried to do the play therapy, I always encourage people to not deny what they see when our children are showing evidence of these spirits that are rising up, and it comes into some form of psychosis. And for us and our families in the community, like you said earlier, Dave and Marla, don't not talk about it.
Right.
You have to engage with one another to support one another, because more than likely your neighbor, your cousin, whomever may be having the same struggle. And we can't deny that we have to help one another in supporting and not outcast that family or outcast that child when they're dealing with these precursors of this psychosis.
Right.
And I just wanted to say I'm just thrilled with your show today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for calling in.
Well, it sounds like, and I want to say the caller's name correctly. Did you say Mrs. Daniels?
Yes, Miss Daniels.
What I hear really, even in her tone of voice, that I can appreciate is an acceptance of the issue. And to me, one of the biggest things, Marla and I had an acceptance rate that was completely different. Marla went all in and let's deal with it head on right away. For some reason, even though, like I said, my dad was a psychologist, it seemed like an indictment on my parenting, on me, to even accept things that were, behavioral issues, especially so young. It seems like, and I don't mince any words, I grew up in a household where I was spanked on a regular basis.
Right.
I wasn't abused. I didn't consider it abuse. But, I mean, that's just how I thought you have to address behavioral issues that are some slight maladjustments. That's how you take care of it.
Right.
I was raised in a Southern Christian home where, the tenet was spare the rod, spoil the child.
Right.
But not necessarily, every instance requires that. And that's something that we have to learn and we have to accept as well.
Did you? Go ahead.
And I have to say this to actually highlight something that Ms. Daniels said. Ladies and gentlemen, all who are listening, please hear me. My tenet is see something, say something, and do something. And I do not mean that this conversation, and I'm only saying this because I am this public, because that's just the life I was actually put into.
Right.
And that's just how it played out. That doesn't mean to announce or broadcast on social media.
Absolutely.
And I have to say that because that's what people may think, oh, well, she says see something, say something, do something. Well, she speaks out on. No, because that's not what I'm saying. But amongst ourselves, that we don't want to discuss it. It's almost like Dave said. There's some strange. This is my fault, and that is a deterrent always to be able to find the right path to be able to get the proper help.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have another caller on line 2, Tammy.
Hi, yes, this is a much-needed conversation, and I really appreciate the transparency as well as the information. My question is cultural and I guess also biological. In cultural, I mean, was there a reluctance to accept certain things that you were identifying from a spiritual perspective? Because a lot of times, we over-spiritualize things. We pray it out, we cast it out, and we don't deal with it in a practical way. And then also, I know certain conditions can be hereditary, even if it's not directly, and maybe they're unaddressed, because culturally we don't call things what they are. But I just wonder, was there also a history within the family line where they can now see, a connection?
Okay, so let me just tell you this: yes and yes.
Okay.
So, ironically, Dave mentioned his dad was a psychologist. Well, when we started understanding the depth of the diagnosis with our children, we were young adults at that point. The actual statement from his dad, the psychologist, was they need to identify more with Christ. That was an actual statement, and I said at that point, because by then the kids are we're tens of thousands of dollars in out of pocket with solution finding,
right?
Because they're too old to be on your insurance. And I said to his father, I said, Dad, is Jesus in the pills? Because when he's on his medication, he's fine. Right. So I'm asking you. In other words, that was actually literally a tag. He's looked at me because that's what, and not no fault of his, God rest his soul, but that's the way he understood it. And then to answer your second question, absolutely, and that's why I distress over the silence inside of our families. Mental health on all sides, deep, and it just is like a tornado. It hops around, and you know that the storm is there, but you're never sure it could destroy this house and leave the neighbor's house untouched.
Right.
That's what mental health is in our family. So it literally, I say this all the time, and my oldest daughter, by the way, has a different father. So I've got dynamics on all sides, including my family, his family, he himself, all the things. And so I've got dynamics on all sides, including my family, his family, he himself, all the things. And so to me, my thing is, man, if I had only known that these things, I could have approached the solutions earlier and different, which is what I've dedicated myself to do with my grandsons.
Mm.
Well, I appreciate you paying it forward, right? Because we don't know what we don't know, but now you do. And so kudos to both of you for the work that you're doing and Dr. V for this platform. And I just want to close by saying, from a spiritual perspective, we got to be really, really careful to not be punitive. I do think the church in particular is starting to recognize the connection between both spirituality and mental health and allowing for the science to be more prominent in its teachings. And I think that's growth on our part. And I think it's becoming more of a safe space, but it's taken us so long to get there. Thank you again.
Thank you for calling in. So the other question that I have for you guys is, did you ever have to, go to the emergency department or interface with the 911 or police or anything along that line in your experience with both of your children?
Yeah, I would say this. With both children, we had emergencies. And I would say this briefly. To get real, proper mental health help, unfortunately, our system is designed to use data for that type of help, especially for people who can't really afford the help that they really need. And I mean by when you talked about Medicare going away, unfortunately, for good health care, they say how many hospitalizations have you had before you can be approved for certain programs.
Right.
And I think that's wrong. We got to fix that. I'll just say that there. But my wife, Marla, has become a specialist when it comes to de-escalation because of our interaction with police. And I'll let her actually explain that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is I'm just going to break this down in steps. It's not your fault, all who are listening. A person with unchecked mental health issues often becomes episodic. The first thing you must always consider is safety.
Absolutely.
And so in considering safety, and we think safety, protect myself, the first thing is you also want to be sure that you're protecting the one who's affected.
Right.
And keeping it safe for them. So the first thing I always do is I advise people, clear the area. If your loved one is in a home, remove everything out of the house. Pets, anything living needs to go.
Right.
Number two,
and anything sharp.
Yes, if you have to, and you when you call 911, the bottom line is I always meet the police outside of the site, and I let them know I'm the one who called.
Right.
That is my son. We're going to deal with. Here is his diagnosis, and this is the best way. There needs to only be two people. He hears voices, and I brief them away from the incident.
Right. Right.
And then I stand nearby, and I don't speak. There can only be one person speaking, because what you realize is if you have to call the police are not mental health professionals.
No, they are not.
They're there to neutralize and make something safe.
Yes. Yep.
It's a threat. They're going to neutralize a threat. And the threat in this moment is the affected one. So if mom and dad are screaming and, my baby, and you're going to charge a situation, and it's going to be much harder for you to get control of it.
Right. Right.
And then you just literally, you have to remember that just because they're having an episodic break does not mean they're unintelligent.
Correct. Correct.
Schizophrenia is involved. What we didn't say is both of our children were super smart.
Yes. So a lot of people.
You tend to put learning disability. It's not true.
Absolutely. A lot of people actually assume that because someone's mentally ill that they've got cognitive deficits, and that is not true. And one of my favorite movies was The Beautiful Mind, where it was the mentally ill professor that won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so, it doesn't, you can have a very, very academically smart child that can still struggle with mental illness. They do not go together.
Right.
Yes.
And I have to throw this in, Dr. V, along with when you make that first phone call to 911, if that's the route that you have to take, and now there is 988, which is strictly about mental health, suicide prevention. But if physical safety is in play, please inform whoever picks up the phone that this is a mental health situation, and to have the PET team or the SMART team accompany
correct
the officers to the scene.
So
because they're going to need to be the ones that make that make that call to say this situation needs to be handled by this person going to an actual mental health scenario versus a criminal issue.
And they'll also have the mental health facility that the person needs to be taken to already identified, and so everyone knows what the plan is. And the main thing is, I guess, along with this de-escalation that Marla's talking about, is to have a plan in advance so that you can calmly help the authorities walk through the process that they need. Because like Marla said, the police, unfortunately, are the first responders when it comes to mental health, and they're not trained mental health professionals.
Right.
They're trained to neutralize threat.
So in Maryland,
by any means necessary.
Yes, by any means necessary. So we are fortunate in Maryland. So if for some of my listeners that are in the state of Maryland, Maryland actually has a behavioral health unit that goes out with the police on 911 calls. And I know about it only because I have a family member that had a mental health emergency. And we were very concerned and reluctant to call 911. And we did eventually because we were more concerned about her safety. And unbeknownst to me at that particular time, I did not know about this program, but Maryland has a whole behavioral health unit that actually accompanies the police on any call that they get through 911 where they suspect that it may also involve a mental health emergency. I think it's really
that's becoming more popular around the country as well, Dr. V. And usually, even in some places where they know that that's the protocol, a lot of times they just don't have enough staffing.
Yes,
that is pretty much the protocol generally nowadays in most places.
So let me ask you. As many of us have family and friends that may be dealing with this. What sort of things can we do to support our family and our friends that's helpful? And what sort of things did people who were good-hearted and thought they were supporting you do that maybe wasn't helpful? So that way we can kind of figure out what are the things that we need to do if we have a niece, nephew, or a family in our community that's actually dealing with this.
It's like everything else in life. You can't really do anything without being educated. You need to actually get the right information. And so David and I, we've been through classes at NAMI, which is the National Alliance of Mental Illness. That's a national organization.
And there's definitely a NAMI chapter near you.
Yes.
They're the largest mental health help organization, nonprofit around in the United States. So they're very helpful. We took classes there just to understand, and that was one of the biggest things that helped us to understand how to deal with someone who's having auditory hallucinations. Mm-hmm. We had to do an exercise where literally we were told to follow some instructions while people were shouting in our ear, and it was almost impossible. So that level of education was important. So.
So they set it up. So wait, they set it up as if you were hearing voices and.
I was in tears because
wow.
When you understood, which our son gave up his license, he's like, I can't even focus, I can't. So
he had a couple of accidents, and he says, I shouldn't be driving.
And so
right.
So the bottom line is, but once we understood, and this is the next thing, please table your blame. I know it's hard, and one of your callers asked about genetics. That's where it gets to be deep, because it's like, well, wait a minute. The finger pointing is almost natural.
Right.
Don't point the finger because there's we need to deal with what is.
It's not helpful.
It's not about, again, the tornado. We know that
right.
the storm exists in our family. It's not about who created the storm. God created the storm.
Right.
So table your blame. That's number 2.
Well,
Number 3. I think that one of the most helpful things is to understand without, like Dave said, especially in the black community or in minority communities, without a punitive consequence.
Mm-hmm.
So we understood once we got an understanding. My son says, I said, D, what are you laughing at? I'm talking to the network. And I
Oh.
said, well, what are they saying? I want to laugh too.
Okay.
So literally, and he used to just hug me because the reality is that's what he's going through.
That's what he's going through.
What
Yes.
good does it do for me to say, look, boy, you're not, those are voices. You're not hearing anything. And the fourth thing is, if you have somebody that's episodic, that is their reality. A
Right.
lot of the time, the anger comes from you trying to convince them that is what is real. This conversation between me and you, we are in a consensus reality, you and I right now.
Right.
Well, if somebody else is over here, it doesn't mean anything other than you trying to tell them that they're ridiculous or they're crazy.
It doesn't change their
Make them
experience.
mad.
It doesn't change their experience, and it can actually make them angry, and it can actually make them withdraw.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it's natural to do, which is why I go back to education.
Right.
Once we educated ourselves, we understood how to talk to them. We understood, to be honest, dealing with our child who has the personality disorder is way harder than dealing with our son who's has schizoaffective disorder and bipolar 1.
Yeah. No. Personality disorders can be difficult.
Oh, my Lord. It's almost, so you have to just learn how to talk and communicate and do all of that. And the final thing I need to say, and I'm going to give this to Dave, a diagnosis, this is the final one, do not hang a diagnosis around your loved one's neck like an identification card.
Absolutely.
I say it's like handlebars on a bike.
Right.
I can't really steer the bike without knowing what the handlebar is the diagnosis. Now I understand what to do and how to lead this situation with the bike. But
Right.
it's not, the handlebar is not the identification of what a bike is.
Yes. No, that's very, very important.
I would just say, to generalize, the main thing to do in all of these situations, as you're dealing with an episode or as you're dealing with some of these behaviors that are hard to deal with, is to always try to take the energy out of the system. Because part of the episodic behavior is almost a tumultuous emotional energy that's hard to contain, and that just kind of continues to feedback and cycle in on itself. And that's the best way for me to describe what an episode actually looks like, and that episodic behavior. So always try to keep that energy down. And for some people's personalities, that's easier than it is for others, but that's something that's necessary to work on, which is why I say find the local NAMI chapter and take some classes if this is something that you suspect that you are dealing with.
Let me give people that information. NAMI is N like in Nancy, A like in Apple, M like in Michael, I.org, NAMI.org. Well, folks, that's a wrap. I want to thank you, Marla and Dave, so much. We've had a lot of fun talking
Can I say
today.
one thing before we go?
Yes.
Can I say one last, it'll be a quick 10 seconds.
Okay.
Our organization, our nonprofit mental health organization, is Loving Beyond Reason, and we specifically deal with parents who have children that have become adults, and you have no control over their medical help and helping them to seek their medical help.
Yes.
They're adults, and so they can make their own decisions. That makes it far more difficult as a parent, because you're a parent and you know that the child, even though they're chronologically an adult, they're
not really an adult. Thank you. Yeah, I will get that website and put it on I will get your website and put it on my website, and we'll be back here next week where you can be informed and empowered about your health.